talking about, yeah. But no, I just always appreciate these moments, because what I'm going to try to do is, I really appreciate, let me just say, the presentation that was going on when I came in and we just finished listening to. I thought that that was just, very brilliantly done. And I think that one of the things that can eventually help all of us is when we understand some stuff that I'm going to talk about a little bit of it right here. But let's see if I can hit it real quick, and that way I will have some time that we can have some interaction with each other as well. So this presentation, I refer to as prophetic ministry in the midst of HIV and AIDS, because there's a way in which, I would always contend that this question of ministry in the midst of HIV/AIDS is one that we should never try to avoid, we should never try to deny, we should never try to act like it's something that does not have a space within what we call faith kinds of thinking, because there's a way in which, in one way or another, it ends up being a part of our individual and collective lives more than we sometimes want to own up to it or recognize it. I was very impressed with the way in which the earlier speaker was trying to suggest the fact that sometimes you get caught up in a way in which you're assessing it, you're evaluating it, you're judging it and thinking about it, when really you don't have probably the kind of framework or the platform that allows you to be able to talk about these things in a way that does not put you in a position of having some sense of hesitation, some sense of reservation, some sense that I'm not sure this is the agenda I want to take into the church, because we already have a lot of predispositions in our own minds about the fact of how you end up thinking that you're going to be received, and having probably good reason for it, because there's a lot of historical evidence. The first thing I want to say to you, though, is that don't ever allow yourself to think, though, that what you're dealing with is something that's within the purview, within the range of what you can easily wrap your mind around. But I do think also that you don't want to get caught up in thinking that it's so complex that you cannot find your avenue to talk about it and your way to address it and to deal with it. And in some instances, it means that if you completely open up to what you're trying to do in that way, you might find yourself getting to where your sense of comfort is such that you might end up seeing even yourself, perhaps, as taking the conversation in a direction that you're not sure you can take it in the church, because of the ways in which there's so many people who do resist it. There's so many people who already have made their assessments of it, and there are ways in which you find yourself even having some kinds of thoughts and some kinds of agreements in your own mind in terms of what you think it represents when you talk about this. It's amazing how little people want to talk about sex in the church, because I don't know anybody that ever got there without somebody having sex. It's like basic, So it's a basic statement of denial, and if you find yourself in a position where you are constantly perpetuating that denial within yourself, then it probably puts you in a position where, in many instances, where you need to have a way of thinking, a way of understanding, a way of dealing with something. If you don't have that, then it creates another level upon which you have a perpetual sense of frustration going on within you. So I would hope that what I'm going to say real quickly, hopefully today, is that things that end up being, I use the word prophetic kind of mildly, because there's a way in which it means that you probably have allowed yourself to somehow become sufficiently at peace, sufficiently in a comfort zone within yourself that allows you to be able to say things that you might not have found yourself in the past saying easily, or found yourself in the past thinking that's to say things in a certain way. It says something about you, and then you find yourself thinking that you want to avoid perhaps whatever that is. I want to suggest to you that the idea of saying it's prophetic just simply means that it takes on a way of speaking that encompasses things that you don't necessarily always include. in the way in which you end up being addressing the issue. You know, you might think of it as being, I don't deal with this in this space or place because it's not the appropriate thing, it's not the right thing, it's not the acceptable thing. But what you have to understand is you have to get to where your comfort level is such that you know what you're talking about. And I'm going to say some things about that as we go forward. So the HIV and AIDS question, let me just tell you how this preacher, this minister, this pastor, this, you know, whatever how you want to say that, comes to is this. It came, you know, some things will come to your doorstep. And I would venture to tell you that these issues related to HIV and AIDS have probably come closer to your doorstep than you care to think about, acknowledge, or deal with. Because there are ways in which you can find yourself looking in the mirror, trying to determine whether or not you have had a moment when you did not necessarily say what you had to say, do what you had to do, with enough sense of thought before you did it. That leaves you in a position of having to question yourself in terms of what you did and how you did it and why you did it. So I want to suggest to you that there's no such thing as not having had the environment in which you could have had exposure to HIV, AIDS, or anything that represents a blood-borne disease, okay? Saying that you have not is like saying I never pricked my finger. It's like saying I never stepped on a tack. Anything that translated into you dealing with blood and the way in which it might have been a part of something you could have exchanged with somebody else. All I'm saying to you is this: get to the point where you know what you know well enough that you can at least have a good basis upon which to make your assessment, to draw your conclusion, to decide this is something that I need to deal with. Because in many instances, I'm sure, I am a few weeks, a month from now, I'm going to be 77 years old. And let me tell you, I have moments when I'm doing this work when I have to reflect on the fact of some of the things I did and some of the things that I experienced when I was 17 years old, okay? And there's a way in which understanding that can't help but give me reason to think about the fact that it's not as though somehow I have had the opportunity to skip it, to miss it, to not be a part. We clearly know that HIV as the virus that gives us the vulnerability to the disease. The virus is something that most all of us, in one way or another, could probably acknowledge once we know and understand something that is something that has been a part of our life experience. It could be something that I never had to stop and deal with it, but in a way in which I maybe should have. I always tell people that one of the most important persons, one of the most important voices in this whole HIV and AIDS is one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. And if you listen to his words, it will help you in terms of thinking about yourself in relationship to HIV. The great philosopher of the 20th century, Michael Jackson. Because you see, it was Michael Jackson who tells you over and over again about the man in the mirror. Because a lot of times what ends up being a part of what we don't get is that we don't look at the man in the mirror enough. And when we do look at the man in the mirror, you need to be well versed enough that you don't end up condemning, that you don't end up putting down, that you don't end up dismissing yourself in terms of where you are in relationship to this reality. So let me just go faster and get to some other stuff. I put this up here for a purpose. And I want to tell you just a little bit. People ask me all the time, how'd you get involved in this? How'd you get involved in this HIV/AIDS issue? And especially to the point that it's in being so central to my whole life for many years now. So I serve a congregation that was founded in 1981. In February of 1981. in June of 1981, a little bit of history about HIV is that that was the month when the Centers for Disease Control released the informational dockets that were telling people about this communicable disease that was starting to manifest itself in the communities that we were a part of in a way that set off an alarm and made people start saying, this is something we have to deal with. Now, it's not that simple. It's not that simple. Because I remember in 1981 when people were talking about and owning up to the whole question of HIV and how it was being contracted as a disease and how it was being transferred to others as a disease. I remember thinking that I was right there off the hook. Because anybody that was around then probably remembers that folks were going around saying, if you had this gift of this beautiful ebony glow that you carry around with you all the time, or anything about your ancestry that says it has a path that leads all the way back to the continent of Africa, if you didn't understand that was not the case in terms of your lack of ability to get HIV, you're way off track. Because this is what got us off the hook in our own minds. They wrote it off by saying, that's a gay white boy disease. And because you thought that that was the truth, then that allowed you to be able to think, well, I'm cool. I'm all right. I don't have to worry about this. But we do know now very clearly that even then it was not a gay white male disease. It wasn't exclusive to anybody. If you were a human being with blood, warm blood flowing through your veins, you were a person who had reason to be concerned about your vulnerability and not to try to use anybody or anything else that gives you your escape, that gives you your way out, that gives you your way of not having to talk about what's going on and not have some sense of concern for the implication that it has for your life. So what I like to always share when I think about this is a painting that actually hangs in the space where we do the work that we do. And one of the things that I always say about this painting is that it's one word in it, okay? It's one word in it, and you cannot escape that word, okay? You can't escape it. The word that's in there is what? Whosoever. Whosoever, right? Because there's a way in which there are a lot of things that we need to know, we ought to try to know. And I think the presentation you heard a minute ago had a lot of those kinds of things in it. But I want to say to you that you can do all you want to try to sidestep it. You can try to deny it. You can try to pretend that it's not you and can't be you. But the fact is, it is all of us. It is all of us. And any of you that have the traditional Judeo-Christian thing about what that looks like, it doesn't take long for you to look at it and see that in the backdrop of that word whosoever, you find the way in which there's an image. Now, one of the things I always like about this image is that there's nothing in the face of the image. There's no identifying characteristic about the face in the image. Because that means it does not have to be black, it doesn't have to be white, it doesn't have to be male, it doesn't have to be female, it doesn't have to be Christian, it doesn't have to be Jewish, it doesn't have to be, you go on down the list. So there's a way in which I always like, and then of course the multicolor thing becomes a very important piece also. The man who did this is a very gifted young artist, but I always appreciate the fact that when you look at it, I've had people look at it and say, oh yeah, I get the message. It's all those different colors. I get the message. It's the images. Like for instance, some people don't get it real quick in terms of the idea of the holes being in the hands and what does that represent. Some other people don't get it because you use the image where you take a cross in order to address that. Just simply for us, is because we're called Metropolitan Interdenominational Church. We got Metro, but if you look at it real hard, you'll see a longitudinal, latitudinal line in it, and all that means is that it's global. It's not about our neighborhood. It's not about anybody's neighborhood exclusively. It's about the world, and it's all around the world. Look at it in terms of the other imagery there. It's all kind of stuff. You go on the other side. It's just a matter of saying it's subtle, but it's one message in it all. and that is it can, it does, it has the potential to impact any and everybody. And at that point, the word whosoever becomes very clear. So I want you to think about it for a minute and then get one more thing out of it. This painting hung in the space of where we do all of our activity at Metropolitan Church. It was a good 15 years there before it ever dawned upon us one day. And this is a term and a way of thinking that I want you to try to carry away from this experience that you have, at least with me, and I think probably experience you've already had. And that is, I tell people, more than the color, more than the image, more than the words, more than anything else in this painting, I think of the thing that is being most significant is the posture. And if you're going to deal with how you rise above this whole issue of stigmatism, if you try to rise above this whole issue of trying to address prevention in a way that you can be bold enough to talk about an ending coming to this issue of HIV, if you want any of that, there's something you got to do. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time now on the next few things I'm going to hit, and it's just talking about what is perhaps the most important thing you're going to have to do. And I think you can take your notes from the presenter that came before me, but I think you can take it for yourself and walk away being able to see this one thing that I don't want you to miss, all right? And it's the posture. What's the posture? What's the posture in the painting? What is it?
Arms open.
Arms open?
Oh, yeah, I was gonna say hands out.
What is it?
Hands out or
Outstretched hands.
I'm looking for one word. That is
stretched.
stretch. Okay? I say the word stretch as being what you're looking for in a way that all the words, everything else, that's fine. But maybe you have to posture yourself to understand that if you want to really get into a position where you are being a part of what it takes in order to have a role to play in the prevention of this particular disease, that one of the things you're going to constantly have to do is be about the business of stretching. And I'm going to show you some stuff that I hope will help in terms of appreciating that. I'm going to skip this next slide for a minute. And, am I hitting the right thing? There we go. All right. And get to this. So we always say if you want to try to get to where you are doing the kind of stretching, that means that you don't just get to come, into these situations which we call religion or faith or the church. It's not something that is a part of what happens on Sunday morning. It's not a part of something that's governed by whichever of the holy books you might read from, that you read from. It might be something that you shouldn't ever allow yourself to be narrow-minded about, okay? Because what we're ultimately talking about is something that impacts everybody and opens a door to whosoever might be in position of not fully understanding how they're going to deal with it. So it's just 3 words, okay? The first word that's up there is the word inclusive. It's significant because you can't draw a stereotype that would say, this is the stereotype of the person who is most vulnerable to this disease. I tell you, you can't do that because there's a way in which I use the word inclusive here because I'm saying inclusive of everybody, and all of us. All of us, okay? You are barbers, okay? Have you ever had an experience as a barber when there was not something that happened that translated into a little nick, a little scratch, or maybe even a little blood that might flow? Is that too far out there? I know every now and then, Ulysses wanted to tell you all that I'm guilty of not seeing my barber frequently anymore. But my son figured out how to come up with a hustle while he was in college. And the hustle he ran into in college was a hustle that let him learn how to cut his own hair. And then he set up his own little barbershop in his room in college. Anyway, but the other thing is the whole question of reconciling. It seems to me, I don't know anybody who talks about HIV, who has dealt with the issue of HIV, who has not in one way or another gotten into a posture of looking at some other, if not some others, in a way that made you decide that that person is not someone that you want to deal with, not someone that you want to be bothered with. And let me tell you, it's infectious disease. I'm going to take it a step beyond HIV because it's very immediate to you right now. It's kind of like even what we've been dealing with COVID. Because how many of you had to deal with the reality of making the decision that you would put masks within reach of anybody who comes in your door, and that if you were going to serve them, you were going to try to make sure, HIV is a bloodborne disease, right? COVID is an airborne disease, and there's a way in which you make sure for your own safety that you would be able to have to make some kind of decision in terms of saying, you have to wear this mask for me to serve you. But that can be very alienating because it's almost like saying, in another way, I'm afraid that you might be susceptible to this disease in a way that I have some reservation about it. I might even have some downright fear about it, right? So, and I'm sure that most of y'all probably in one way or another figured out how to deal with that in these last 4 years or so since we've been dealing with the dynamic of COVID. But there's a thing about reconciling, and this is what I tell you about the whole idea of faith, because there's a level upon which it's never enough to stand at a distance, to be outside of relationship with, to deal in a face-to-face, hands-on way with people who you're trying to share some information to in a way that might help them to avoid any incidents that could translate into their being infected by this disease. Then there's a way in which you have to be willing to be engaged in a way that perhaps maybe you have to put some standard in your head and your heart. There might be a way in which you might want to draw some line in terms of what's acceptable and what's not. But there's a way in which it always comes down to your willingness to be engaged. Engaged necessarily in a conversation that might mean that you're not in close proximity, but yet you're at the same point where if you're both hearing and if you're both responding to what you're hearing, then there's a way in which you need to know that those need to be some principles you deal with. You got to be realizing it's inclusive, it's reconciling. It's where you have to get over your stuff. It's the way you have to rise above your fears. It's the way in which you have to create the way in which you have an appreciation for everybody in a way that allows you to be able to want to do something that could help instilling the spread of a disease in a way that will allow you to have and to recognize the role you can play in this disease not going any further than it is. I use this picture, this image for a reason, and that is just the whole thing of realizing it's not about thinking in ways that have the kinds of limitations that are there. Whenever I use this slide, I always think about the way in which sometimes we disassociate ourselves, not just in terms of who we are, in terms of human beings, but also in terms of things that are part of a lot of the dimensions of human nature and character. Because there are ways in which social understanding and social ways of engaging and interacting can be a part of what puts you in a position of vulnerability. There's a way in which people very often find themselves not appreciating how the money and perhaps the lack thereof turns into being a major factor that you have to deal with. It is a political issue because there are ways in which you know there are folks that have different kinds of attitudes and perspectives in terms of what they expect out of those persons who end up being a part of electoral politics, and knowing that what you are dealing with is something that has significance in terms of anybody that you want to support in any way. It could be something that's psychological, and that's why I'm here, is to talk about the fact that this aspect of the issue, the spiritual thing about the way in which you find yourself. It's amazing how many people run from, deny, and don't allow themselves to take advantage of the knowledge that they could have, just simply because they've made up in their minds that it's not something that's right. That you've become the judge. You've allowed yourself to become the judge and to write people off in many ways. So it's interactive in terms of, I'm going to go so far as to say everything you do. Everything you do. Because there's a way in which, dependent upon the disease and how it is being transmitted, one of the things you need to know and appreciate is that it's not a whole lot of ways that you can say there's no sense and no way in which this has anything to do with me. So I'm going to go a step further and say this to you. You know, be careful about that first one. You know, the whole idea of, information dissemination. Let me just tell you, I always tell folk, and I tell folk this everywhere, you know, this is not some, this ain't for what's going on out there or over there or with them, they, and those. I'm saying it's something that's a part of the whosoever. And that is the whole business of letting this experience in relationship to what we're seeing and dealing with in HIV get to the point where we understand how to think about these issues and not to be so vulnerable in our own lack of willingness to think about the issues in a hard kind of way. It's important to note that I tell people all the time, what I'm always trying to help people learn to do is go further and further down the road of how to think versus saying anything to people about, about what to think. Because a lot of people have drawn a lot of false conclusions. A lot of people, as you were talking about earlier, have a lot of misinformation. A lot of people who would try to tell you what is the way to deal with this issue of HIV. They don't have a full breadth of understanding that's sufficient enough for them to be able to truly be able to share with you. It's amazing how many folks will tell you what, they've been told. And what they've been told ends up being nothing less than what is wrong and not complete and thorough in the way it's happening. To do this and get it right, let me give you this phrase. It requires consciousness raising. We sometimes allow ourselves to consider complex issues on such a narrow level that we miss perhaps the significance of the moment. So I always say what we're doing requires looking critically at what you see and responding to it. So it gets to where it means not just things that happen in some kind of cursory manner, but rather it requires looking critically at what goes on. It doesn't make a difference where you are. It could be anywhere from what you're doing in your house to what you're doing on your job to what you're doing in any of the environments and any of the situations you might find yourself in it. It's important to get to where you learn how to look critically at what you see and then have the wherewithal to be able to respond to it. It's not something that you can write off. It's not something you can dismiss. It's not something you can deny without paying a heavy price. It ends up being the case more than anything that you end up with yourself in a predicament where you will become vulnerable to something that you would have said that you never wanted to allow happen. So it's important to deal with essential characteristics, challenges, traditional assumptions, the things that you still believe because your great-grandmama, great-granddaddy are people who never had any real depth of experience or knowledge, have perhaps given you some ways of thinking about something. The traditional assumptions will make you think that things can happen that don't usually happen. Traditional assumptions can make you think that perhaps what you're dealing with is not as significant or dangerous as it is. So I would say to you that we all have to be on top of our game. It means that it calls, if you hear it and you know it and you come to understand it as being a part of the problem we're addressing, then what you have to do is, if you know it, you need to begin to see yourself in the mirror as somebody who has some degree of accountability in terms of being able to share it and in terms of allowing it to be a part of your life experience and behavior. Because you see, that's the way in which you'll be able to share with others in a way that would allow them to have the kind of possibility. We know if we want to deal with people who seem like they're vulnerable, we need to understand that if we understand this, then what we need to do is everything we can to empower the disinherited. How many folks come and sit in your chair and you know in one way or another that their self-assessment, that their self-expression, that their self-attitude, that their self-behaviors, that their self in everyday life is probably a part of what makes them as vulnerable or more vulnerable than anything else you can look at. I say all this in relationship to faith. I say all of it in relationship to talking about, the church or whatever you do in terms of that kind of expression in your life. The whole idea is to not succumb to and not to give in to a kind of thought process that makes you think you don't have to deal with it. Head on, straightforward, and without any sense of fear or compromise. It's something you have to be willing to say, I cannot know this and not do everything I can to address it. I cannot be aware of this and not put it in my life schedule in terms of how to share it. I can't do that because to do it puts me in a position of being one who's a part of the problem instead of someone who's a part of the solution. It's our choice, but there's a way in which it helps if you understand how to exercise that choice. Because too many people that we work with, too many people that we serve, too many people who sit in your chair, too many people who you help to get the image that they want to have in terms of their way of seeing themselves and the way in which others in the world sees them. One of the things that you have to realize is that in many of those instances, they're in that chair because they're trying to do something that's a part of what helps them to rise above that which has been a part of the stigmatizing reality of how people have looked at them, how the people do look at them each and every day. They actually come into you asking, help me, in terms of to have an image, help me to have a posture, help me to have an understanding so that I'll be able to do what otherwise I would never have had the ability to do. So you've got a lot of power, you've got a lot of opportunity, You need to have a lot of insight and understanding. You need to be the ones who, when you speak, you're speaking not out of a framework that's about something less than knowledge, okay, and wisdom, and insight and understanding. That's who you need to be. And I think each and every one of you can handle that.